being super successful and achieving a lot of really big milestone things oftentimes is associated with internally feeling like a failure and completely non-deserving of all of it. Okay. This notion that I am a failure, even though I'm objectively a success, is actually quite common with regards to high achieving individuals. And that is what I dive into in this particular video, exploring specifically the connection between trauma and low self-esteem and how that distorts the sense of pride and the sense of achievement in high performing individuals. And while I normally work with entrepreneurs and kind of dive into the business aspects and the entrepreneur aspects of this, for this particular video, I'm using the clips from Sean Strickland, who is a MMA fighter. He is a former UFC champion who is very open about his traumatic past and in many ways how that drove him into martial arts. But I specifically go into clips from his last interview. This is when he was doing a rematch to get his belt back that he lost previously, where he's talking about his kind of general association with what it means to have a UFC belt. And just for context, if you're not an MMA fan, firstly, being an MMA champion in the UFC is an extremely rare thing. Like it is a super, super hard thing to do. He has achieved it, and as you'll see in the clips, he talks about that as like that's just this thing that like lives in my closet, and I haven't actually like looked at it, right? It talks about that achievement in a very discounting sort of way, right? Now, fundamentally, that's not necessarily right or wrong. What I draw from that is his connection to why that is from the perspective of self-esteem, and I go into deeper commentary on the clip around how can you actually use this to make connections in your own life about why do you discount your achievements? Why do you have such a hard time resting? Why do you have such a hard time when you're not actually, working? Like all of these things are rooted in this association I have with work and achievement and how that powers the life that I have. So without further ado, here is the clip, and then my commentary follows along with it.
It's like, is it really different now that you've held the belt?
Let me tell you, the curse of being an abused kid. You are born with natural low self-esteem. Like, it doesn't matter what you do in life, you always look at yourself like a failure. Like Eric asked me to bring my belt to give to he wanted to show.
So there's 3 points there that I was highlighting while he was talking. So number one is what the interviewer asked him first, which is, now that you've held the belt, is this any different? And he's basically saying, no. The curse of being an abused kid is that you are born with low self-esteem. Okay, so that's 2. And then 3 is no matter what you do, you're always going to be a failure. Okay, so all of that is very real, but it's fundamentally untrue. So how can something be real and also untrue at the same time? Okay, it seems to be like a paradoxical thing. And when it comes to self-esteem, that is what it appears like, but that's not actually how it operates. So what is the real part of what he describes? It is his experience, okay? Growing up as an abused kid is 110% a terrible, terrible experience to go through. His pain, his suffering, and also his drive to get out of that situation and all of the inner turmoil it causes, that is 110% real. It is undeniably painful and real. What it rests on, the inherent assumptions around it, the narrative around it, and the foundation, like the foundational perspective of what that means about him, is fundamentally also not true. And the core part of it that is untrue is when he talks about no matter what it is that I do, I am fundamentally a failure. Okay, that is a perspective, that is not a fact, especially when you're talking about something like I won the UFC belt, which so many people go after and they can never achieve. Okay, regardless of whether you defend it or not, it's a totally different conversation. But fundamentally, you interpreting that as failure is your own interpretation. It's not actual absolute fact. Okay? And in two, you are born with low self-esteem. That is inaccurate, because self-esteem, and this is something I'm going to be borrowing from the book Six Pillars of Self-Esteem by Nathaniel. The 6 pillars of self-esteem are basically 6 practices that the author, Nathaniel, describes that, like, if you do and embody these practices, so if you think, feel, and act in alignment with what these practices call, you will establish a foundation where it is a natural byproduct to have a high judgment of yourself, to hold yourself in a high esteem. Okay? Which is essentially what self-esteem is. It is how we perceive how valuable we are to ourselves. It is our own judgment of ourselves. So low self-esteem is not something you are born with, because it assumes that you were born with the capacity to actually judge yourself before you have learned anything about the world. And for anyone that has small children, you know, like at the time of this recording, I have a 1-year-old. Like, his perceptions are of the world in a very reactionary way. He doesn't have a prefrontal cortex and a higher brain to actually kind of meta-interpret what it means in relation to other things. He can't actually judge. All he does is actually react. So you fundamentally cannot have an assessment of yourself if you also cannot have a sense of self outside of just being a reactionary being, much like, you know, a dog or whatever. So that's number one. Number two, right? If we're talking about self-esteem as a series of practices that create the foundation of self-esteem, well, what you practice is what you ultimately ingrain as the norm, right? So if you're looking at this even in terms of like any skill, you know, it's not that practice makes perfect. It's that practice makes permanent, meaning what it is that I've repeated fundamentally becomes the thing that I exhibit essentially by default. So if what you have repeated tens of thousands, if not millions of times, are these messages and then beatings and abuse on top of that, that you are worthless, that you are a failure, that you'll never amount to nothing, that your very existence is one that is useless, then fundamentally all you have repeated is the practice of essentially anti-self-esteem. Things that reinforce verbally, emotionally, and physically, i.e. create a practice that becomes the anti-self-esteem. It becomes everything to give you evidence of why you fundamentally should not have a high self-esteem of yourself. Okay? Over time, that becomes the lens through which you view all future accomplishments, including something actually like ridiculously significant and rare, like winning a championship UFC belt. And that is fundamentally why the experience of the low self-esteem is extremely real, but it doesn't actually exist. It doesn't actually root itself in truth. Okay? So that's kind of like the number one aspect of this, which is how self-esteem relates to what it is that he talked about as far as like, this is what's real. Okay? So now let's look into a bit deeper into some of the things that he says.
Eric asked me to bring my belt to give to, he wanted to show his daughters like a sports team. I was like, yeah, dude, I haven't looked at since I won it. It's been in the closet. I think it's like one of the curses of like having like low self-esteem. It's just, you know, when you're a kid, dude, and you're just a doormat your entire life. So every time I go in there, it's always like this moment of like, you know, do I really belong here? But I will die for what I want. And I've lived my entire life on that.
Okay, so this is also very relevant because he really speaks about, do I really belong here? do I really deserve this? So we're actually fighting against reality now, because like you wouldn't have won something if you didn't quote unquote deserve it, or at least earn it that particular night. So all of your training and your skill sets have brought you to the point of actually objectively deserving this thing in that moment. Right? I'm not getting into like all of the other stories of, you know, defending it and all. That's a totally different discussion. I'm talking about like that particular moment. To then discount that as, I just put this in my closet, I never look at it, I'm not even going to be proud of it. Okay. That is like trying to put something that doesn't fit on, in this instance, on top of this idea that I'm a piece of shit, and it's just something nice cannot actually fundamentally go on top of that. So if we go back to the pillars of self-esteem, one of them is self-acceptance. Okay, it's the third pillar of self-esteem, which is self-acceptance. And one of the pillars of that, okay, and I'm just looking at my notes now. So the way that he defines, and we're talking about, again, the 6 pillars here, self-acceptance is my refusal to be in an adversarial relationship to myself. So self-acceptance is the refusal to be in an adversarial relationship to myself. What is an adversarial relationship to myself? I am constantly in conflict, in battling between the part of me that has learned that I'm not good enough through messaging, physical abuse, and the feelings that go along with that. So that is ingrained in my psyche and in my nervous system. And I'm fundamentally always adversarial with that part of myself, and what the outside world and what the outside evidence is trying to tell me, which is actually the opposite bit of that. Okay. The tendency for me to refuse that conflict and begin to move towards self-acceptance, where it's like, I did have this history, which obviously he's aware of that and he talks about that openly. But to accept that and to begin to open up that while that is true historically, it doesn't have to be that way in terms of how I interpret it, and that I can actually improve the relationship I have with myself if I begin to look and feel into these things more deeply. Then that conflict ceases to be as powerful. Okay. And this is really something that I see working with clients quite a bit that have had a lot of success, where it's hard for them to step into their own magnificence. In fact, one of the exercises that I get clients to do many times is to just write a list of your own magnificence and to let that be the anchor from which you sell. Like, for example, so I'm thinking of one particular client example where she's basically helped filmmakers raise millions across all of her coaching. Okay. Another one that's raised millions for like auctions. Okay. Like 175 million. Like when we met, like that was her total lifetime money raised. Okay. Another one that's had like a career of athletics and drumming, and is just like working with a whole host of like VIP clients in terms of like body work and massage, etc. And for all of them, they always discount their achievements. Like it's just like something that's not that important. Generally, if we can't accept that good things can be reflective of a bad interior or interpreted bad interior, it's going to be very hard to be at peace with a lot of these self-esteem aspects. So what is the ultimate point of all of this outside of just like commentary and kind of like feel good or interesting information? It fundamentally comes down to a few things. Number one, if I want to stop suffering, then one of the things I have to do is actually begin the hard work of self-acceptance. And self-acceptance doesn't mean liking all parts of myself, liking all parts of my past, or acquiescing to the fact that there are certain things that just need improvement. It means accepting without additional baggage and drama what is currently here, what is currently part of my history, and using that as the backdrop to create something new. It is a chance to have higher standards for myself, right? So this was looking at Sean's particular example. It's like, if the world is telling me that I'm actually operating here, self-acceptance means I am operating down here in terms of how I value myself. In this particular gap is something that I have the choice to fight for, right? This is the adversarial relationship with myself. This is what the evidence is telling me. I'm keeping myself down here. The gap between those two is actually suffering. So in order to close that gap, this is where the healing work actually begins. It begins in looking at why that is, releasing the emotions that are stuck there, releasing the narratives that keep those emotions active, and ultimately healing the nervous system to feel comfortable in acceptance of yourself, to feel comfortable of what reality and evidence is actually telling you about. Okay? That is the topic for a deeper video. If you are a high achieving person or a business owner and you want to evaluate these types of gaps that create the stress in your life, that cause you to not accept yourself, etc. There's over 64 stress drivers that I assess in my Peaceful Profits roadmap. The link for that is somewhere around this video, so you can let me know. I'm happy to walk you through that. And if you're a business owner, we translate that into profit and time leaks that are currently stopping the growth of your business, and then ultimately how that translates into recapturing that and using it to make more joyous, peaceful profit inside of your business. So if that's of interest, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching and see you on the next one.